to exploitation of a hardened MSP430 device so early, trimming your evenings short. This is also known as reverse engineering of a real estate lockbox. My name's Braden Thomas, or Dr. Springfield on Twitter. I'm a research scientist at Accubon, where these days I focus on embedded devices, reverse engineering, and some exploit dev. Previously I worked at Apple Product Security, so I have kind of a software background. If you're a software guy like me, then I assure you, while this is kind of a hardware talk, it'll be very approachable. So first I'm going to explain what this lockbox is that I looked at, and how the Android app that accompanies it works, and how I reversed it. I'll tell you how to open it, and then we'll cover firmware extraction from MSP430s, which is what's inside of it, the techniques I used, and the techniques I tried to use, and what I found inside, and there'll be a demo. But before we get into that, why is this interesting? So from a high level, with the Internet of Things and Kickstarter, you're seeing a lot of people produce hardware on a very low budget. You know, people who might not necessarily have a lot of experience with producing hardware, but they're also attempting to embed, you know, security because there's this increased scrutiny on device security. So they're trying to implement cryptographic protocols, and oftentimes these are based on symmetric keys that they're embedding in general purpose microcontroller flash memory. And this is cheap and easy, but it's not necessarily the best idea, and I think this lockbox is a good case study of why. Finally, it's interesting because you can hack into houses over Bluetooth, and that's obviously why I was initially interested in it. So the lockbox in question is produced by an unnamed manufacturer because these issues still exist out there in the world. They haven't been patched yet. It's a real estate physical key container. So it's #1 in the market in the US and Canada where it's used. And essentially, if you live in any major urban market in the US or Canada, if you put your house on the market, they'll put your keys inside one of these, and they'll hang it on your door. And then real estate agents can come up and open your house using their smartphone. There's 3 models. There's the oldest lockbox. It's been on the market for a while. It's IR only. There's the newer lockbox Bluetooth, and then the most recent Bluetooth LE, which came out just this past year. These devices don't have internet connectivity. They connect to the internet through the keys. The legacy key is a cell radio based key, but you know, it's kind of expensive and you don't want to lose it, so these days everyone uses eKey. It's an iOS and Android app, and you might also need a dongle or a key fob for your phone, because you know, original iPhones, or all iPhones, don't speak legacy Bluetooth, and most phones don't have IR ports. So the first thing I did was look at the Android app, because you know, Android apps are trivial to reverse engineer, and I focused on the authentication algorithm. And when you initially run the app, it prompts you for this obfuscated blob token thing. And if you reverse the app, you see that it essentially deobfuscates into a serial number and a syscode. And a syscode is just an integer that corresponds to a regional market. So I'm from Atlanta. It has 1 syscode. Some very large markets like Southern California, which is I guess what they call LA now, might have a few syscodes. Now when you enter these in and they're deobfuscated, they're used as a credential to speak to the manufacturer's backend web service. They're actually the only credential used. The web service will provide the app with authentication cookies, which are just binary blobs of data. The app then transmits these cookies to the lockbox over Bluetooth or IR. Now the key to the security of the lockbox is that the real estate agent must provide a PIN code. This PIN code is associated with their keys, serial number and syscode, in the cloud somewhere, and that's required to open the lock. So when I reversed the Android app, I noticed there were 2 authentication modes supported by the app. The deprogrammed auth, it's used very rarely, only when moving locks between syscodes. Generally in the field, programmed auth is used exclusively. And it's quite complex. There's a lot of cryptographic operations. And a lot of these cookies that were downloaded are sent. So first it sends the identity cookie, which defines what key it is, then a configuration cookie, then an obtain key message, which incorporates that PIN code, then a key auth cookie, and then finally, if all of these cookies validated successfully, then the device will open. So while initially I would want to just modify these cookies, they all contain AES max, so that's not possible. Additionally, the key sends what it calls update bytes, and these change every single day, and you have to download them from the server because they are themselves an AES MAC. And finally, each key can only generally open a lockbox in its own syscode. So while I mentioned keys have syscodes, lockboxes also are in a syscode. So at this point, it should be clear to you I needed to access the firmware. I'm not a real estate agent, so I don't have a valid serial number or syscode at all. Even if I were able to obtain one via social engineering or buying a key on eBay or something, I wouldn't have the key holder's PIN code. I'm not that good of a social engineer to ask for one. And even if I had one, I would still have to communicate with the manufacturer's server every single day to essentially maintain access. And then, they would know that I'm doing something bad. So to access the firmware, the prerequisite is opening the device. First, it's fairly easy to cut off this hard plastic shell, leaving you with just the metal. And there's a couple of hex screws you need to remove. But the hardest part is you have to open the key container. And so for that, you need either a legitimate E-key or an exploit, and I haven't told you any exploits yet, so you just have to trust me. The Bluetooth model is like that. You have to do all of that, and you also have to cut this shackle off, which is kind of difficult. And then you have to pop a couple of rivets on the back, which are extremely difficult. And so it's not ideal to get into the Bluetooth models. This is what the board looks like. You see the top and bottom of the original lockbox on the left, and the top and bottom of the Bluetooth on the right. And the Bluetooth LE model is essentially identical to the Bluetooth model, except it has a LE chip instead of that legacy Bluetooth serial module. On both tops, you see a large microcontroller. Those are the MSP430s. So the older lockbox has a 147, which is in TI's 1 series of MSPs. And if you're not familiar with the MSP430, it's used in a very large variety of embedded devices, hundreds of devices. And there's a number of different series of MSPs denoted by the first number of the chip number. So 147 is in the 1 series. The Bluetooth module is a 248, so it's in the 2 series. They both have serial IR transceivers because they both support IR, but the Bluetooth adds an ST Microelectronics Bluetooth serial module. And they both have an EEPROM, and the EEPROM isn't used to store code or keys or anything, stupid like that. It's just used to store the visitor log. So whenever someone connects and authenticates with their key, an entry is added to say, hey, this person opened this lock. So before I got into reversing the board, I made the decision to focus on the older IR lockbox. And that was because the board's easy to obtain, so if I destroy it, it's not that big of a deal. And as everyone here knows, older software, older firmware is more likely to be insecure. But the fundamental thing to note here is that the keys, the cryptographic keys on it, are identical. So if I extract the keys from the older device, I can authenticate to the brand new device. So why not focus on the oldest device? And my process is pretty standard. I mapped out the test pads using continuity testing and a data sheet. This is an image I created for myself to map them all out. I found debugging interfaces in the microcontroller and extracted firmware through those. So MSP430 firmware extraction. If you're not familiar with this topic, there are 2 methods to extract firmware from an MSP. There's first is JTAG, and there's a 4-wire and 2-wire variant on MSPs, but this 147 only supports the 4-wire. And as soon as you connect up, you see that the security fuse is blown, so you're totally out of luck and JTAG is prohibited, leaving you with just BSL. And BSL is also known as Bootstrap, TI's Bootstrap Loader Protocol. It's a serial interface. And generally it just permits read and write access to flash memory. It's not a full debugging interface like JTAG. It's implemented with code stored in a special region of flash. In these chips, it's a read-only region. And the problem with BSL is that nearly all access to it is restricted with a password. And cleverly, TI used the interrupt vector table. The interrupt vector table is inherently unique and secret because it consists of the addresses of the interrupt vectors in your code. So every single code project has different, code size. So their interrupt vectors are different. And it's secret because I don't know what your code image looks like. That's what I'm trying to extract. So I don't know what your interrupt vector addresses are. And it's 32 bytes. The entropy isn't totally random. You can do some guessing, but it's still not really brute forceable. The only command you can perform over BSL without knowing that password is mass erase. And then all the flash is erased, the password is reset to the default, but you've lost all the code. In 2008, Travis Goodspeed released a white paper called Practical Attacks Against the MSP430 and did a couple of presentations on it. And he described 2 attacks, a voltage glitching attack and BSL password comparison timing attack. I attempted to do the voltage glitching attack first. I had a good FET22 laying around, which has an ADG1634. It's an a digital controlled analog switch. So you can define a high and a low voltage using the onboard DAC with the good FET, and then you can switch between them digitally. So before you do that, we want to remove the target chip from the board and put it on a smart board or something. Step down the voltage on all your data lines to it, because the MSP runs on extremely low power. It actually will run on a grate. So if you give it a full voltage data line, it will continue running. I should also mention this is only feasible at all on BSL 1.x because BSL 2.x added a mass erase on the very first incorrect password. So obviously you're going to be trying this multiple times. It's not going to work the first time. So it would be very difficult on 2.x. Fortunately for me, 147 runs BSL 1.1. So my attempt to perform this was a failure. When I decreased the low voltage, conceptually I was running it at the higher voltage and then switching to the low voltage for a clock cycle. The device either continued running undeterred, or if I dropped it below a certain level, it died altogether. And there was no sweet spot where it glitched. And my conclusion is that the MSP on the good FET was too slow to glitch this target MSP. BSL runs around 1 megahertz. The good FET could be clocked up to 16 megahertz, which I did, but I believe it was still too slow. I'd like to try this again on a chip whisperer or something. So anyway, I moved on to the BSL timing attack. There was more information on it. Essentially, Travis found that the byte comparison routine for receiving the password had a single clock cycle timing difference between the correct and the incorrect paths. So his strategy was to take every possible byte, so 0000 times 32 to 32 byte password up through FFFFF, and run those, send those, and so that obviously will be 256 attempts, and measure the number of clock cycles it takes to process each one. And by that you can determine the byte makeup of the password. So if this one takes 1 clock cycle less, then the password has one of those particular bytes somewhere in it. So he looked at a number of BSLs. He didn't look at my BSL 1.1. It's easy to pull it and reverse engineer it, and you can see in the password receive routine, it iterates over each byte, so it receives the byte, and then it compares that byte that it received to the interrupt vector table at the correct offset. If they are not the same, it takes an extra clock cycle to OR a value into a global state that says this password was incorrect. Now, if you want to exploit this, you need to think about how serial communication looks like on the wire, because it occurs between each received byte. So BSL, it's one start bit, 8 data bits, a parity bit, and a stop bit that's bit banged by BSL. So for the start bit, between every byte, the BSL bit bang code will do a busy wait, waiting for that start bit to go low. And if that busy wait occurs more than just one time, you've kind of obviously destroyed all the timing information that you had built up until that point. Because at that point, you've run some indeterminate number of busy wait clock cycles, and who knows if you spin an extra clock cycle comparing a byte, 4 bytes ago. So you want to make sure that only runs once. And additionally, the device will check that the receive line is high after the stop bit. So you're kind of stuck in between this stop bit and start bit situation. Let's look at it graphically. It's difficult to understand. So if you look at byte n-1 stop bit, and then you look at the start bit of the next byte, the timing between there is what I call the inter-byte timing. And so the device will check the stop bit is high after, or check that the line is high after the stop bit, and then wake up and check that the line is low during the start bit. And if it's not low, it'll busy wait. So it's easy to say that determining this ideal inter-byte timing is just the number of instructions times the clock speed. The problem with saying that is that the clock speed is highly inconsistent on this chip. The BSL code runs under DCO clock, which is a software clock. You can't force it to use an external crystal because that's controlled by peripherals. Additionally, the number of instructions run vary because the timing vulnerability itself. Any mistakes you make in this inter-byte timing will be multiplied by each byte 34 times. There's 32 password bytes and then 2 checksum bytes. So to see this graphically, again, the normal serial timing will have a very large inter-byte timing. So you'll see the device will wake up, the line is high. After the stop bit, it'll wait for some time, and then it'll wake up and check for the start bit, and it won't be there, so it'll busy wait. And conceptually, to find the ideal inter-byte time, we're going to slowly shrink it over time until we've eliminated those busy waits. And if we go too far, one of 2 things could happen. We could wake up for the stop bit while it's still low, and that causes an error. Or we could miss the start bit entirely, in which case we'll busy wait all the way until data bit 1, and we'll think it's the start bit, and that'll be a gigantic disaster. It's important to mention that you can't determine the ideal inter-byte time on a chip that you don't know the password to, because if you don't know the password, you're going to get a NAC. If you get the timing wrong, you're also going to get a NAC. So there's no way to determine the difference between these 2 serial NACs. So my plan was to test this, determine the inter-byte timing on a same model chip with a known BSL password. I used an external crystal on my good FETs just so there were no timing problems on my end. And I slowly decreased that inter-byte timing until the correct password was no longer acknowledged. And then I known I'd gone too far. I found the run with the lowest overall time. I eliminated all the busy wait cycles. And then that's the ideal inter-byte timing. And I can go use that on my target chip to perform the timing attack. And this is a graph of my results. So as you can see, the x-axis is time that I'm removing from the inter-byte time. And you can see the total time decreases linearly until I reach a global minimum. And that's when I've removed all those busy wait cycles and I found the ideal inter-byte time. So while that graph looked really great at a macro level, I found that it was wildly inconsistent at the micro level. Overall total times to process a password would vary by actually thousands of attacker clock cycles. And the attacker clock is running much faster than the victim clock, but still, it's significant. I tried modifying the victim's BSL, just like a test victim BSL, to expose the bit read time by twiddling a line, and I confirmed sort of what I was believing was happening as I was eliminating these busy waits. The problem is that the timing between them would change between runs. And I believe that this is due to the BSL's DCO clock, the inconsistent DCO clock. So I tried just focusing on the very last byte of the password. If I could at least get the last byte of the password right, I would only need to get the 3 interbyte timings correct, just between that last byte and the 2-byte checksum. So I found the interbyte timing, the ideal interbyte timing, and then I tested it on my victim chip. And I tested each possible byte 10,000 possible times. And I graphed the overall time, and this is what I got. So this was kind of a shocking graph to me. What I would expect to see is a straight line where every single incorrect byte took the same amount of time to be processed, and then the one correct byte took a single clock cycle less. It was clear to me that this attack, my implementation of this attack was a failure. And I believe that this is due to the BSL's DCO clock inconsistencies during the terror routine. So the way BSL determines the timing of its serial, it's not actually like a fixed baud. It actually measures the length of time that the first bit sent to it takes, measures it in clock cycles. And if there's any inconsistencies in this amount of time, that will be multiplied for every single bit that it receives. So there'll be just sort of large differences that don't appear to average out in the short term. At this point, I was quite sad. I had exhausted the 2 attacks, and I had failed on both. But fortunately, there was a third attack. This is an attack I call the paparazzi attack. It's a firmware extraction technique that bypasses the JTAG security fuse that Travis Goodspeed told me about due to the photoelectric effect. So to review MSP430 JTAG security, there are 2 sort of categories of fuses. There's a physical fuse, and once it's blown, it's permanently programmed. And then there's an electronic fuse, which you program by writing to a certain address in BSL, but you can then erase it later. And this attack does not work against those fuses. Now, when you want to speak JTAG, you need to do a fuse check. And on these physical fuse devices, the way you do that is you hold TDI high, and then you toggle TMS twice. And current is measured on the chip going in through TDI and across the physical fuse, and then the chip logic remembers the result. To perform the paparazzi attack, first you need to decap the chip, and you want to ensure the bonding wires remain intact because you're going to be doing electrical testing, obviously. You might need to do jet etching for that. I don't decap myself. I send it to a lab. It costs less than $100, and it's quick and easy. You're going to run a tight JTAG loop on the reset tap and fuse check operations. And then every 200 or so iterations, you're going to perform an authenticated action, by which I mean an action that requires the existence of the fuse. And so what I just do is I read the first word in BSL memory space, which is on this chip it's C00, and that's a pointer to the entry point of BSL, which is C02. So while you're running this tight loop, and then occasionally checking is C00 point at C02, you're going to expose the decap die, and you're going to hit it with a camera flash. This requires multiple attempts. When you see that valid data, you succeeded in bypassing the fuse. You're not going to want to power the chip down or flip the reset line. Obviously, this requires good fence software modification. It likes to flip the reset line a lot. During this attack, you want to power the chip externally. I've noticed it uses a lot of current when in this state. And so don't power it with a good FET, power it with a benchtop power supply. And don't expect it to be in a normal state after this. I usually just read the BSL password and then I reset the chip. If you want, then you can speak to it over BSL, extract the full firmware, you can flash it on another chip if you want. Why does this work? So I mentioned the fuse check works by measuring current across the physical fuse. The photoelectric effect is an effect whereby transistors will release electrons when struck with photons. So my belief of understanding of the way this works is that the high energy photons from the xenon camera flash hit the transistors in the fuse check mechanism and cause them to switch and cause the chip to believe that current has in fact passed across that fuse when it hasn't. At first, one of my coworkers thought perhaps there was some UV radiation erasing a memory cell where a JTAG state was stored. If you have seen Bunny's attack on the PIC microcontroller, but I ruled that out because a digital camera flash produces minimal UV, and this attack is instant, whereas the UV attack takes a significant amount of time. So unfortunately, my live demo, the chip was damaged in transit, so I'm going to have to show a video. But I can pass around the device if you want to take a look at it, and it's damaged now, so you don't have to worry about breaking it. Okay, so first thing you're going to do is, this is rather challenging, but you're going to connect to the good FET, and it will read the JTAG ID, which you can do with a blown fuse, just to confirm that it's connected properly. The next thing it will do is to read a register value, and there's a certain register value you can read that will give 555 if the fuse is in fact blown. And then the next thing is that it will start running the JTAG fuse check, the tight loop, and then you should see me flashing it with the camera, and then you can watch the result. Yeah, I'm sorry, the chip was broken. As I mentioned, this takes multiple times. Though when I first did it, it actually worked maybe one every 3 times, and okay, so it successfully read the BSL password. I've noticed that as the chip sort of gathered dust on the die, it certainly takes longer than that. Okay, so what did I find in this particular firmware? So if you have done any MSP430 firmware reversing, this might look familiar. What I saw was a calling convention where arg1 is passed in R12, arg2 is passed in R14, and any remaining arguments are pushed to the stack. The return value is R12, though if a 32-bit value needs to be returned, it will also use R13. This is a 16-bit processor. The only really unique thing about the actual process of reversing this firmware was that this sparse index switch statement will use this construction where it calls a common method which reads the return address off the stack and then finds this data structure after the return address where it defines where to return it depending on the switch. And IDO doesn't know what to do with this, obviously, so you'll need to manually decode it. And this is actually a really good pointer to interesting areas of code because switch statements usually indicate protocol parsing. The other interesting thing I found was that a surprisingly large amount of the firmware was due to IRDA. It's serial over IR. I didn't even realize at first that IRDA was being used. The device bit bangs IRDA. I call it serial-ish. It's like serial, except the pulse width is much shorter than the actual bit width. And you can sniff it directly, raw IR, from a test pad on the board. It's easy to decode with a custom logic plugin, the serial-ish. And the neat thing is that when you export it from Logic, if you do a little post-processing, you can open it up in Wireshark, and Wireshark decodes like basically everything above the data link layer. So it's really useful. So what did I find in the firmware? First, I found how the crypto really works. I found that there's actually 3 authentication modes, not just 2. There's a hardware backdoor, and then finally I found that the memory read and write command that I knew about that permits reading the EEPROM actually had a special mode that lets you read and write a very small segment of flash. I'll talk about why that's interesting. So the crypto architecture. I discovered that despite all the keys and cryptography I saw, there's actually only 2 keys that are important, sort of the root of trust, AES-128 keys. There's a per device key, and this is rarely used in the field. If you do use it, you get a very high authentication level, and you can do things like deprogram a device. I'll talk about that in a bit. But the key that's primarily used is a syscode key. So when you're opening a lockbox out there in the world, this is the key that's used. And it's shared by that entire geographical region. So the whole city will use that one key. They were good in that these keys are never exposed to the app. They're not extractable by any commands, remote commands. The only way to, you can extract them using the JTAG attack, but that is rather expensive and kind of painful. Now, the syscode key is provisioned on the device by some unknown process at the local MLS office when the device is in a deprogram mode. They must have some authenticated channel to obtain it in a raw form. I don't know what that is, but once it's programmed on the device, a MAC key and an encryption key are derived from it, and those are the only keys that are actually used. It's never used raw. And the MAC key validates cookie integrity, and the encryption key encrypts any other ephemeral keys, of which there are plenty during communication. If you compromise the syscode key, you've won the keys to the kingdom, because you can generate fake authentication cookies. You can open any lock in your geographical region without leaving a trace. So I mentioned there's a 3rd authentication mode. So this authentication mode, which is not in the Android app, permits access to the visitor log in the EEPROM, which is obviously only useful if the device has been opened. But the important thing is that it requires no authentication cookie to perform this authentication. You just walk up, you say, I want to use auth mode 3, and it says, here's the visitor log, essentially. Now, the visitor log contains the serial number and syscode of all the keys that have authenticated. Earlier, we were lamenting the fact that we didn't have a serial number and syscode because we're not real estate agents. This solves that problem. But you still don't have a PIN code. So let's talk about brute force. They're only 4 digits long. There is an aggressive lockout, and it would take a whole week to brute force the pins if you waited. But the lockout counter is one of those things that's stored in the EEPROM. So if you open up a lock, you can brute force a pin code immediately just by erasing a certain byte in the EEPROM after every 10 attempts. And so at that point, you can actually clone someone else's key. You have their serial number, you have their syscode, and now you have their pin code. The problem is that you still need to communicate with the manufacturer's server every day, and so they can, track you down, and kill you. That's a joke. Okay, so then there's the hardware backdoor. So there's deprogrammed authentication. I mentioned before, and I called it that because the Android app only uses that when the device is deprogrammed. But it actually can be used when the device is in a programmed state if you know the per device key, that very secret key that gives you a very high access mode. There's some process to get it, I assume, but maybe by a local MLS office. I can't access it, the attacker can't access it, but the important thing is that this authentication mode contains a hardware backdoor. So if you ever see this in code, you should be worried. P3.1, peripheral 3.1 goes high, and immediately the code tests peripheral 3.2. If it is low, if the values are not the same, then it skips authentication and this backdoor mode is in effect. And that's because they're connected to each other through a resistor. If you desolder this resistor from the board, you can bypass this off mode and you get this high level of access. You can also destroy the resistor with a single drill hole in the back of a lockbox, and then you can just immediately open it up. If you know the exact right place to drill, it won't destroy any other components. You actually see it took me 2 attempts if you look closely. But so the fourth thing I discovered, I mentioned that there's a memory read and write command. And we still haven't been able to achieve extracting the syscode key, the keys to the kingdom, without the decap attack. Now, the keys are stored in a segment of flash called information memory. And this is protected. If you mass erase the chip, it's erased. But so if you're an MSP developer and you want to write to flash, you have to erase that segment of flash between every write, even if you just want to write 1 byte in a segment. So this memory write command, I mentioned there's a hidden mode that lets you write to a small segment of flash. And this segment of flash happens to be the same segment where the keys are stored. Though you're not allowed to do a partial overwrite of the keys or anything kind of clever like that, but you can write to maybe an unused byte in that segment. And what happens is the device will take the whole segment, copy it to the stack. It will then erase the segment, as it needs to do, modify your stack buffer, and then write the whole segment back. The stack is in RAM, and RAM, it turns out, is not erased by BSL mass erase. So here's the final attack. First, you use the hardware backdoor to authenticate. You get the high level of access you need to perform a memory write command to that flash segment. You write just 1 byte to an unused location. It copies that segment to the stack, modifies it, and writes it back to flash. Very quickly, you reset that device. You perform a mass erase of the device over BSL. I mentioned that's the only command you can perform without knowing the password. And then you can read out RAM, you can collect the stack buffer, and you get the keys to the kingdom. When I performed this, it was successful. I did write a special good fed application that counts the clock cycles, because when I tried to do it naively, the stack had already been overwritten. So basically, you run this application right before you perform a memory write command. You send the memory write command, and the application waits for the right amount of time, resets the chip, puts it into BSL mode. At that point, kind of at your leisure, you can mass erase it and read out RAM, get the keys. Obviously, this attack can only be performed once because you've destroyed your chip, but you have the syscode key. You can run wild through your city, breaking into people's houses and doing whatever people do. So unfortunately, that attack does not demo well. So I'm going to demo the hardware backdoor. This is a device that I have drilled a very small hole in the back here and destroyed that resistor. As you can see, it is locked, but using the deprogrammed off, complete. Okay, good. see it opens right up. At that point, if you open this hex screw here, you get access to the board, and you can perform your flash write and erase attack. Okay, so conclusions. The manufacturer in question, we disclosed these issues to them in June, and they were receptive and started working on the fixes, though I don't think they're out there in the world yet, but I think they will be very soon. If you're a device manufacturer, which I'm not sure there's many here, I would avoid storing cryptographic secrets in a general purpose microcontroller. There's a bunch of secure storage chips out there where you can perform cryptographic operations directly on them, and they're hardened against physical attacks. But for us, I just say go forth and hack all these devices. There's, as I mentioned, hundreds of devices using MSP430s. Surely many of them are using the vulnerable lines of chips. So this attack is, while a little bit of a pain, it's not that technically difficult to perform, so I encourage you to give it a shot. Some thanks to some friends who helped me, and of course Travis Goodspeed for his phenomenal prior work on the MSP. So, any questions?
Questions?